Good afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Lori Rose, President of the League of Women Voters of Lake Forest, Lake Bluff area, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Civilly Speaking, Conversations in the Town Square. I would be remiss as a league president if I didn't take a moment for an infomercial to invite you to our upcoming book club, which is on November 16th, and back by popular demand, our live in-person holiday luncheon on December 12th, which will be at the Deer Path Inn. And for the first time in many years, possibly ever, this will be free to all members. And for non-members, there'll be a $45 charge. And we hope to enjoy a nice lunch and get to actually see each other in person on December 12th from 12 to 2. So information about these events will be, as usual, in our voter newsletter and also listed eventually on our website. And now back to a little bit more about our program today. In earlier times in a small town, a guilty gossip who had spread rumors about his neighbors approached a wise man seeking atonement for his sins. The wise man advised him to go to the roof with a feather pillow, tear it open, and spread the feathers out to the wind. The gossip followed the instructions and returned to the wise man. The wise man then advised him to stay on the ground and collect each one of the feathers. The gossip was stunned. He stated that he couldn't possibly gather the many feathers that had floated all over town. "You're right," explained the wise man. "It's not possible. It also isn't possible to repair the damage caused by your harmful words. We must speak with great care." Our thoughts exist in a private sphere. Once they've been articulated, they're no longer private. It's clear that the adage about sticks and stones is false. Words, even when offered as humor, have caused losses of dignity, of friendship, jobs, spouses, and even elections. How does the power of the spoken word impact the work of the League of Women Voters? Our history and our mission, empowering voters and defending democracy, require us to create and articulate consensus positions. We welcome robust dialogue and debate, and our equity and inclusion policy welcomes all voices up to the moment of consensus. Consensus requires active listening and respect. When we listen while thinking about our dislike for a speaker or the next thing that we plan to say, we're not truly listening. When we use intentionally inflammatory words with each other, we are sabotaging both present and future opportunities for respect and consensus. In public meetings in the town square, the loudest, most disrespectful voices can create environments which destroy democracy by discouraging good people from public service. The community looks to our league expertise and collective voice for issues related to voting, other issues, and advocacy. Our 100+ year nonpartisan history has enabled us to earn the respect of elected officials and leaders, many of whom are also local league members. If we are to preserve this valuable legacy with our communities and with each other, we must continue to speak with great care. Today's program will provide us with insight and tools to facilitate and preserve that precious skill during a critical inflection point in the history of democracy. And now I'd like to turn the program over to Katie Anderson, our Vice President of Program Action and Advocacy, for introduction of today's panelists and the protocol for this program. I'll be back during the Q&A. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you, Lori. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, fellow league member Lynn Gaffigan. As a mediator, Lynn supports professionals, families, and community members in having more successful conversations, managing conflict, and generating creative options for moving forward. As lead faculty for 12 years of the DePaul University Dispute Resolution Center Family and Divorce Mediation Program, and now through her private training programs, Lynn works with attorneys, mental health professionals, financial advisors, clergy, guardians, collaborative divorce professionals, and others to apply communication and conflict resolution skills in a variety of settings. Lynn is an appointed member of the Mediator Screening Committee for the Circuit Court of Cook County Domestic Relations Division. She's a past co-chair of the Chicago Bar Association Alternative Dispute Resolution Committee and a past president of the Association for Conflict Resolution in the Chicago area chapter. A graduate of Emory University School of Law, Lynn's legal experience includes business matters with King and Spalding in Atlanta and Music Peeler and Garrett in San Diego, followed by a family law and mediation practice in Chicago and Lake Forest. Lynn is also an author of Child Custody Mediation and a co-author of Employment Mediation. Our second featured speaker is Dr. Matt Dewar, whom many of you may know from the Community Church of Lake Forest, Lake Bluff, and is a teacher and the well-being coordinator at Lake Forest High School. Motivated by his own personal struggle with anxiety as a young adult, and informed by almost 2 decades of teaching mindfulness-based social and emotional intelligence in schools, Dr. Matt Dewar's message is simple. Through increased awareness, knowledge, and skill, you have the ability to transform stress and adversity into emotional strength and resilience. Matt has shared his message with Fortune 500 executives, collegiate and professional athletes, and school districts across the country. He is the former president of the Coalition of Schools Educating Mindfully, and is also an author of the Mindful Breathing Workbook for Teens, and also Education and Wellbeing and Ontological Inquiry. And Lynn, up to you. It's your turn. There we go. Lynn?
Step 1, unmute.
There we
Thank
go.
you, everybody. So there's a lot that we'd like to cover. And we'll hold questions to the end just so we can get through a certain amount of presentation and don't duplicate things. I'm going to start really big picture, and then we'll go more and more specific to individual behaviors and ideas that might be helpful. We'll take a look at some of what you're already doing in the context of personal interactions, and then we'll pull them apart a little bit and see if there's some ways to either look at them differently or get a little distance or stay a little more present yourself in a conversation that's challenging. I'm gonna focus on what I'm talking about, and I think Matt is too, on individual things that we can do and that we can control. This is not a separate thing, or this is somewhat separate from creating really strong boundaries on a political level. We're not going to be talking about advocating on a political level. We're going to be talking more about what do you do when you get into that smaller setting, either individual or in a community dialogue, that maybe could be helpful in restoring some of the interactions and some of the damage, helping with some of the damage. So we want to strengthen boundaries and limits, but we're going to focus this time on communication skills in and around that, assuming that's already going on. Does that make sense? To the degree, if we can see you, it can be more helpful in presenting just to see people's reactions. I know not everybody can do that, but if you can be part of it, it's best. I want to talk a little bit about what some of our natural instincts are in these high conflict situations. We've got, I think, to take a look at how we're interacting with people a little bit more than just the substantive aspects of it. So one of the things I guess I'll ask is, has anybody been feeling a little bit cranky or tired or maybe angry over the last couple of years? And are you wondering whether it's just you, or are we trying to just figure out where to affix the responsibility for this problem? I can't see you all, but the ones I can see nodded, so that I don't know if that's good or bad, but it just is. I think I'm going to, can everybody see this screen?
Yeah.
It's not exactly
want
the
us-
way.
Do you
It's
want
not
to
a-
hit
it's not-
slideshow? Can you hit slideshow? That'll make it bigger.
That'll make it bigger. I thought I had it on slideshow, but apparently I don't. In any event, you know what? I'll just do this. Can everybody see it?
Yes.
All right. Everybody getting the gist of this? Okay, I admit it, we're lost. But the important thing is to remember, is to remain focused on whose fault it is. And so it feels a little bit like the environment we've been in or felt like we're in for a while. One of the people who has written about this and done a lot of research, scientific research through Columbia University's dispute resolution programs is a guy named Peter Coleman. He's a social psychologist. He's written a book called The Way Out. I don't know if you all can see me. And he says that this situation that we're in right now is more complicated and more difficult than any that, based on his research, we've been in since Civil War times. And that we really need to take a look at a new way to look at some of these problems. Some of the things his research shows is that we're condensing problems into very small, manageable bits, but that indeed they are much more complex. And this is on a national scale as well as the way we as individuals are perceiving them. And so he comes up with 5 things that he thinks we should do to try and pull out of this. I'll talk more about some of this as we go forward, but one of them is make things more complicated and be willing to look at new and somewhat radical ways to make change and to change things up. So how do we make things more complicated? Well, when you think about conversations and you think about the way that we are interacting more and more, what are some of the things that come to mind? Do we have conversations or do we have debate? And what is the difference between those two? And what are the forums that we're conversing in? And where do they lead us in terms of how our conversations take place? So if you have a forum online, and I don't want to pick on Facebook, anything that people don't usually sit in the same room, read body language, respond in the moment, and perceive the whole of what's going on with the person, but instead state their position. How is that impacting us on a community level? Well, it's having a lot of impact. And one of the things it's doing, not just at a community level or even at a national level, but it's also doing that on the level of neurons in our brain, because we're not feeling heard. And as things begin to escalate, or we feel like things are escalating, we're getting more and more frustrated. Because think about a Facebook post or a tweet. Does a tweet say, give a position, and then does someone else tweet, okay, so I'm not sure I totally understand. I think that you're saying X, Y, and Z. Could I ask, which is more important to you? A, X, Y, or Z? Is that what you are thinking is going on the internet? It's not, right? It's not, and it's not even debate. It's really more just powering opinions at people. So this is having an impact in the level of intensity, and it's having an impact literally combine that with the isolation we've all had, it's having an impact on how our brains are wired. Because remember that your brain, neuroplasticity, right? Your brain can change based on your experiences. We have these experiences over and over and over again. We've been doing this for quite a while. We've also been isolated to some extent. And so our brains are adapting. Well, one of the things as a mediator, I think I'm observing is that our brains have adapted to the point that we've somehow forgotten some of our strengths in conversation skills. We are learning really, really well how to speak as though we're a headline in a newspaper. Everything is expressed to grab attention, show a little bit of conflict, a little bit, and express our opinion in a way that has a lot of strength. Because that's what we've been receiving and hearing, and we're not anticipating that someone's going to acknowledge what we've just said. One of the things that we automatically do as humans that we're not even aware of is place responsibility somewhere else. But when you combine all that together, the word that I think is important in all of this is dignity. We're starting to get rid of the dignity of the conversations. So one of the things that I think is important, have you all seen this? A lot of people have seen this before. Mm-hmm. Does anyone want to weigh in on when they first look at this, whether this woman is an old woman or a young woman?
I see a young woman with her head turned away with
her head turns away. Does anyone see an older woman and her nose is right here? And her mouth is right here. Do you see that? And some people see one automatically and some people see another. And unless you're aware of what this is, you would say, well, we're not looking at the same thing. We're not agreeing on the facts. Now, this is a factual perspective just to give this idea. But I think the area that we're overlooking is, so what's the meaning of that? If someone sees something very differently, how is the meaning changed for them? And what conclusions are they drawing? So one of the things we want to look at is how can we see things from another perspective? There's one more piece that I think is really important, and we'll see if we can get this to play. And we might not be able to. Well, maybe we can. Hold on.
So a final experiment that I want to mention. Is our fairness study. And so this very famous study, and there's now many more because after we did this about 10 years ago,
everybody see this?
Very well known.
Mm-hmm.
And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys. And I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. It has now been done with dogs and with birds and with chimpanzees. But with Sarah Brosnan, we started out with capuchin monkeys. So what we did is we put two capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group. They know each other. We take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the two monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now, if you give the partner grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so if you give them grapes, it's a far better food. Then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently, we videotaped it with new monkeys who had never done the task, thinking that maybe they would have a stronger reaction, and that turned out to be right. The one on the left is the monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests a rock now against the wall.
I love that she tests it.
And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest that you see here.
Okay, so I love that so much. Many of you may have seen it. It went around for a while on, I don't know, somewhere I got it. And I thought, this is perfect because I'm a mediator and everybody's talking about how they want everything to be fair. And of course, in divorce mediation, that means you're going to split your child into 50-50, absolutely evenly. Which, is that possible? Do children divide in half? Can you control how their loyalty is divided or their sense of comfort? Or no, but do you know they love their parents pretty much no matter what? Yes. It's just very hard to define fair and make things equal. And what is the meaning of fair? Why is fair so important? And it's clearly not just important to people. I mean, this is an instinctive reaction, right? I love that they tested this on dogs and birds, and this had somehow determined they had the similar outcome. So what's the meaning of fair? In a conversation, what's the meaning of fair? Because that's not exactly what I would consider how you're going to solve the problem. If you have a piece of paper and a pencil, write down a few things that you think might mean fairness might mean. What about your personal value? Your identity? Does that make sense? Your dignity? What about power imbalances? If you're not going to get or have enough control over whatever deal you're trying to make, or you're not going to have a say, an equal say in something. So there's underneath all of these conversations, we're all talking substantively. Underneath all these conversations are relationship aspects that are more meaningful and more important. So when we talk substance, we really want to get underneath that and get to the meaning and talk about what's important to people about that. So if I say, what's important to you about 50-50 custody, which isn't even a legal term anymore in Illinois, with your child, what's important to you about that is what I'm trying to get at. Well, I want to be, what are really the interests there? I want to be a full parent. I want to have a role in my parents' life. I want to be present. I want to be accounted for. I want to have a say. These are the things that are important. And I think on a national level, when we look at this, when we have processes that don't acknowledge and get at what's important, we don't have conversations that allow us to say, so wait, you made that statement and I'm not sure what that means. Can I ask you a couple questions so that I'm sure I understand? And what's important to you about that? And if I was to list some moral values that someone came back at you with during that conversation, would you expect someone who had some very important moral values to divide those 50-50 in order to reach agreement with you? Do you see what I'm saying? Just like you can't divide a child. It's very hard when you get to the meaning and you get to the value, what's important to them, to divide that in half. You need to get at everybody's interests underneath, their values, their needs, what's important to them, and then talk about what are some options that we might be able to discuss, and how can we create some things that we can't even see right now, because we're only seeing either the old woman or the young woman. We're not seeing the options, but we're going to keep working until we can find some things that meet everybody's needs. We may have to do a little horse trading at the end. We may have to cut around some things, but we need to problem solve on a level that isn't about dividing really important things in half. And why is that important on a national level? Why are we polarized? Why are we stuck? I think part of it, and we can all, like on your piece of paper, write down 10 reasons we're polarized. I'm sure you could come up with at least 10, right? You could argue over why we're polarized. You see how this is not good. So what we want to do is get underneath that. And I have a handout, by the way, that anyone who wants to just send me an email. I'll post my email in the chat when all of this is done. And I'll send you every site that I'm talking about, every author, every study is listed in this handout. And I'll add to it anything you asked me that I forgot to put in. I'll add to it and then I'll send it to you. Peter Coleman talks about how really, really stuck this is, like dramatically stuck, because we're doing this to each other, in my opinion, on so many levels that even the media, which is on your list somewhere of reasons we're polarized, is there are people in the media presenting at conflict resolution programs, and they're coming up with new programs to present in school, journalism schools, to see if they can get away from creating conflict with every single headline. I just feel like I'm assaulted when I read the paper. I just feel assaulted because as a mediator, I'm always looking to de-escalate. How well do you think when you're afraid? How well do you think when you're angry? How well do you think when you don't feel physically safe, or when you think someone in the room is going to ask you to give up something that you value and is just going to try and argue you out of it? So here's the skill I'd like you to take with you. Learn and think about how to acknowledge the substantive or emotional or needs and interest aspects of anything anyone is saying. And don't just think you understand what's important to them. Ask. So it sounds like safety and security is important to you in this dialogue, in this discussion. Is that correct? And the person could say, no, but then at least they'll correct you. And they know you're listening. They know you're heard, or they've been heard. I would also say in your conversations, acknowledge and let go of the goal of trying to convince someone else. Now, this is counterintuitive. Your goal, I think, on an individual and community level is to rebuild relationships or maintain them and to be curious and learn. It's the number one rule of AA, right? Don't try and control things you can't control. There's some research that just came out recently talking about the outrage addiction that we all have. We're addicted to outrage. And Peter Coleman from his research would say we are indeed. We're stuck. We keep going and we keep going back for more. It's like the addiction to Facebook. Why is that? Because it makes you angry. Dopamine hit. Same idea. So we want to de-escalate. Acknowledge, number one. Number two, let go of the goal of trying to convince someone else. There's a new study out of Germany that says, yeah, you know what? Conflict resolution training really helps. It helps possibly because it's reminding us how to do things, because we've been looking at these quote unquote role models for a number of years now, not behaving well, removing dignity from a conversation, acknowledging out loud, very simple, very hard to do, because what are you doing when someone else is talking? You're waiting to answer. You're thinking about what you're going to say. If you're really listening and you have to repeat back what you understand, even if it's word for word, that's summarizing, and that really is pause will make a huge difference. It helps tremendously. And I'll tell you one other reason why I think this is important. Then I want Matt, turn this over to Matt. And there was a presentation by, and the site is in my handout, out of the University of Chicago Political Science Department. He studies terrorist threats, things like that. One of the things he found was that there are 23 million people in the United States, I don't remember the percentage, 8 maybe, who believe that have come to believe that violence might be a good way because we're so polarized and we can't otherwise talk to each other. I think this acknowledging people's concerns is becoming critically important. The other thing is, he said, funny thing, this isn't all red and blue. We need to remember, right? This isn't just because someone votes a certain way does not mean you understand all the ins and outs of what's important to them and how they cut one way or another. But even in terms of violence, 10% of the people that said yes, that's a viable alternative, were Democrats. And there was a very large percentage that said that they were independents. And the people that said this were also not all from rural areas by any means. I'll send a link in this handout I really recommend watching this little presentation, if only to remind you how important what we do on an individual basis is. And that's all the time we got. And I hope you have questions, please write them down. And Matt.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for attending. Let me share my screen now. And I need to move this over 1 second. So again, thank you for taking your afternoon to attend this presentation. I'm going to explore the impact emotional intelligence has on civil speech and our ability to communicate. My computer's stuck. Obviously, we have limited time. This is a huge topic, as Lynn already said, absolutely enormous topic. But I think in the time that we do have, we can explore some kind of fundamental principles of emotional intelligence and maybe even walk away with a few practices that can help us develop and deepen our level of emotional intelligence. So here's my thesis just up front. You cannot effectively communicate without emotional intelligence. And so we need to explain then what emotional intelligence is, create at least a loose working definition. Emotional intelligence is the ability to identify, understand, regulate, and communicate emotion. Let me say that again, because that's a lot. Emotional intelligence is the ability to identify, what am I feeling? So you might even take a moment right now and ask yourself, what am I feeling? Identify what you're feeling. Then you might ask yourself, why am I feeling this? So giving that feeling context. I'm experiencing a particular emotion right now. Well, I'm likely experiencing it because, and you understand the factors that contribute to the states that arise within you. Third part, the ability to regulate emotion is, well, do I need to do something as a result of what I feel? Maybe right now I'm giving a presentation. What if I was giving this presentation and I was just overcome? This is not the case, but let's just pretend I was overcome with sleepiness. I felt like I could just fall flat on my face. Well, now there's a disconnect between what the moment is requiring and where my internal state is. So how do I regulate that? How do I adjust my internal state to be where I need to be in a given moment? And then last, do I have the ability to communicate emotion? When I'm feeling something and I need to communicate it to someone else, do I have the words to do that? And then the flip side of this is not only the ability to identify, understand, regulate, and communicate emotion within ourselves, but also within other people. Can I identify what you're feeling? Can I intuit maybe why you're feeling what you're feeling? Is there something I can do or say to help you regulate what you're feeling if you're out of sync? And is there something I can do to help you communicate what it is you're feeling, to name what it is that you're feeling? So needless to say, emotional intelligence is extraordinarily important because it touches on everything we do in life, that we are at every moment of our conscious waking experience living through our emotions. And so the four main competencies of emotional intelligence, this is how you break it down. And we're not going to get lost in this, so don't worry. Don't worry about this. We're not covering all of this. The four main competencies are self-awareness, self-regulation, social awareness, and relationship management. Right? So there's a nice symmetry here, understanding what's going on within myself, having the ability to regulate it. And then the next two are social awareness, understanding what's going on in other people's experiences. I can infer what you're feeling by looking at you and being with you. And then I have the skills to help you manage or help us manage our relationship. What we're going to talk about today is self-awareness. And why self-awareness? Because self-awareness is so unbelievably important. It is the foundation of your emotional success in life. It is the foundation of your ability to effectively communicate with other people. If you are strong in self-awareness, you will be strong in those other three competencies I just identified. If you struggle with self-awareness, you will struggle with the other three competencies. It's so important to have self-awareness. And so three big ideas or basic principles. Self-awareness is an essential life skill, right? As I said, everything we do is through our emotional experience and through the emotional experiences of other people. So we're constantly linking and connecting our internal emotional experience with other people's internal emotional experience. So having an awareness of how this happens is an essential life skill. Number two, most of us lack self-awareness. So this is what the data shows is that one, it's tremendously important, and two, we're notoriously not very good at it. And here's the thing. We get even worse when there's conflict, when there's stress, and when there's threat. Whatever self-awareness we do have diminishes significantly when we find ourselves in the midst of stress and threat. And we'll talk more about that in a second. And then third, this is the good news, right? The bad news is we're not very good at it. The good news is it's very trainable with practice. We can get better at self-awareness. Some people tend to show up to life dispositionally with more self-awareness. You're not doomed if you show up with maybe not so much self-awareness. It's something we can practice. That's the good news. Again, we're sticking to broad conceptions here. Self-awareness has two components, and these are important. The first is internal self-awareness, and I'll explain these more in a second. The second is external self-awareness. So there's two components to self-awareness, this vital foundational piece of emotional intelligence. You can think of these two as a teeter-totter. If internal self-awareness is high, external self-awareness is typically low. If external self-awareness is high, internal self-awareness is typically low. So internal awareness or internal self-awareness is the ability to be aware of what you're experiencing within yourself. And if we tend to be very strong at noticing that, we tend not to be so great at noticing how other people are perceiving us. Of course, this makes sense because if our attention is inward, it's not outward. So if you think of attention as a spotlight, it's not shining in two places at once. So if you're focusing that spotlight on your own thoughts and feelings, you're going to be excluding awareness of how other people are seeing you. Okay. External self-awareness then is an awareness of how other people perceive you and see you. And some of us are very attuned to how other people perceive us, so much so that we forget what we feel inside. And so most people tend to show up to life stronger in one than the other. So if you're stronger in one, you need to do work on the other. And the idea here with the teeter-totter analogy is that you want a level teeter-totter. You want to find the ability to have access with both, to know what you're feeling, but not be preoccupied, consumed in what you're feeling. And you want to know how other people are perceiving you, because that's a really important skill. You want to be able to see how other people are perceiving you without being preoccupied and consumed by that either. So finding this balance between internal and external self-awareness. And every time we're having a conversation, this is what's going on. It's this dance between feeling what your thoughts are about a particular issue, putting them into words, communicating them, hopefully observing the impact they have on that person, watching them, watching how they're perceiving you and receiving what you're saying so that you can maybe modify what you're saying or how you're saying it. And then they do the same. And it's this dance back and forth. Now, the problem is that when we get stressed or in a heated discussion, we'll tend to focus on the area that we're strong in. So if we're in a tense conversation, we're going to be consumed at the other person being angry, and we're going to be afraid that they're perceiving us a particular kind of way so that we might not do justice to what we feel. If we have an abundance of internal self-awareness, we might get into a heated conversation and then get totally lost in our own emotions and stop paying any attention to the person who we're talking to or how they're receiving what we're saying. And of course, online communication does such a disservice to all of this because so much of communication is embodied. It's about seeing how someone actually is experiencing their emotions non-verbally. When you communicate with someone virtually, all of that is taken out. There's just words. And then you have to make inferences about what those words may or may not mean emotionally. And so this is where we can start to improve internal self-awareness. And it begins with a fancy term called interoception. This is what neurobiologists call the ability to be aware of the body's internal state and the meaning we assign it. So what's my internal state right now? And this is with students and colleagues. I'll show this scale. And I want you to do this right now as an exercise. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being you're feeling a tremendous amount of what they call emotional arousal. You're very amped up. There's a lot of emotional energy going on inside of you. That would be a 10. So in the red, you can even imagine the dashboard of a car. I say this to students. If the engine is working really hard, the RPMs are redlining, right? And then 1 would be you're so calm that you could probably just fall asleep within moments if you close your eyes. So very low emotional arousal. And then 5 is right in the middle. It's the perfect blend of alertness and calm. So right now, let me ask you, where are you at on this scale? Where is your internal state on this scale in this moment? And if anyone wants to share, I'll start. I'll share. I'm at a 7. And so then the next question is, how do I know that I'm at a 7? What information is my body giving me to let me know that I'm at a 7? Well, there's tightness in my stomach. And I'm talking a lot. And because I'm talking a lot, my breath is more up in my chest. So my chest is a little tight. And I feel a little bit of pressure in my head. I feel very alert because I'm giving a presentation and there's 20 some people on this presentation and I want to make a good impression. And so all of this is going on. So I'm elevated, right? And my body is telling me through my stomach, through my heart rate, through my breathing, it's telling me something about my state. And so these are the questions. Is my internal state high or low? What bodily information is that based on? Often our stomachs and our breathing and muscular tension tell us where our state is. So if you said that you were at a 5, or you said you were at a 3, or if you said you were at a 9 or a 10, you're basing that number off of those muscular tension in the body, how your breathing feels, maybe even your heart rate, if you can feel it, and how your gut feels. Those are the main areas of information telling you, am I stressed out or am I relaxed? And then the third question is really important, and this is so important for conversation. What meaning do I assign that information? So let me go back to this. It's possible to be at a 10 and you assign 10 a negative meaning. 10 can be, oh, I'm so anxious, or oh, I'm so angry, or a whole host of negative emotions. Or 10 could be excitement. 10 could be anticipation, right? 10 could be, I'm on a roller coaster and I love roller coasters and this is the funnest thing in the world. So just because you're high or just because you're low isn't inherently positive or negative. We assign positive emotion or negative emotion based on prior experience in similar circumstances. And I think you can all immediately now understand the importance of how this connects to conversation. Maybe someone grew up in a home where every time there was a heated conversation, there was a division in the family and it became an environment that felt either maybe emotionally or physically unsafe. And so every time they have a conversation now and it drifts there and their internal state is elevated, they assign that 10, oh, this is not good. Or maybe you grew up in an environment where conversations were tense, and when they got tense, it was just the moment before there was a breakthrough understanding. So you understand that tension as a necessary bridge and doorway into common understanding. So when you get to 10, you're like, oh, we're almost there. Right? So we bring these stories and these beliefs with us and how we're self-aware with our internal state. And so how we communicate is going to reflect this and express this. And so the last question is, why do I assign that meaning, right? There's prior experience that has us determine why things are the way that they are. So some basic strategies for developing internal self-awareness. Practice developing an awareness of breath and body. And the research shows that as little as 5 to 10 minutes a day for as little as 6 weeks actually makes functional changes in the brain, in the medial prefrontal cortex, a part of the brain that's associated with the executive center of the brain, your ability to pay attention and your ability to self-regulate. And what they found is that people who practice just a basic awareness of their body and their breathing for 5 to 10 minutes a day after 6 weeks, the medial prefrontal cortex of the brain is more active and has greater density measurably on a fMRI machine from before and after 6 weeks. So it doesn't take a lot. Another strategy you can develop, Mark Brackett, who's at the Yale University Center for Emotional Intelligence, wrote a book about this, developing your emotion vocabulary. That having nuance with how you talk about your own emotion seems to be correlated with higher levels of self-awareness and higher levels of emotional intelligence and skill. And children who grow up in the presence of adults who have a wide or a broad emotion vocabulary also develop greater emotional self-awareness and emotional intelligence. So practice developing new words for identifying your internal state. This is just as an aside. I found that mindful breathing is the most effective access point for developing interoceptive awareness. That really, and I'll show an exercise here at the end. I have a machine that measures breathing chemistry in real time, and I work with individuals developing that self-awareness through breath awareness. And I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. But what's so fascinating about breathing is that breathing is the body's first line of defense against stress. Let me say that again. Breathing is the body's, your physiology's first line of defense against stress. That if we go back to that continuum of 1 to 10, if you're heading up and you're getting more stressed out and you're getting more emotional arousal going in your physiology, your breathing will reflect it immediately. Your breathing will change. How you inhale will change. The location of your breath will change. The transition between inhale and exhale will change. And most noticeably for most people, the way you exhale changes. As people get stressed out, they cannot complete an exhale. They feel a lot of tension at the end of an exhale, and they do something what's called aborting an exhale. So they get about 2/3 of the way through the exhale, and then they immediately drive the inhale. And I'll show you what that looks like in a moment on real-time breathing biofeedback. And so a lack of interoceptive awareness is called alexithymia, which comes from the Greek, a lack of words for emotions. So when we lack this awareness of our emotions and the emotions that we're experiencing, and we lack names for our own emotions, it's referred to as alexithymia. And they think about 8 to 10% of the population has a severe, like diagnosable case of alexithymia, but they're realizing more and more that there are moderate and mild versions of alexithymia. And there's even emerging research and theories being constructed right now that because we are so preoccupied and perpetually distracted with our devices, that we are increasingly losing interoceptive awareness. We're increasingly losing awareness of our internal state, so that we are becoming a society of alexithymia, people who don't know what they're experiencing because they're so distracted. Never before in human history have we had the ability to be so permanently and continuously distracted, right? We are the most distracted and disconnected society the world has ever seen. And so this has a tremendous impact on our emotional self-awareness and our awareness of other people's emotions as well. So obviously this is affecting how we have conversations. If we don't know what we're feeling and we're not reading what other people are feeling. Now I bring up the case of alexithymia because there is an inverse relationship between alexithymia and empathy. So when you lack the ability to understand, to identify and understand your own internal state, you will likely lack the ability to identify and understand other people's internal state. Empathy is about experiencing someone else's experience, feeling for them, feeling what it might be like to be them. When we don't have this emotional self-awareness and we can't feel our own experience, then we can't simulate in our own minds what it might be like to be someone else. Now, what kind of conversations can we have if we don't know how we're feeling and we can't name it or understand it, and we can't simulate in our heads how someone might feel receiving what it is we're saying? So it's very, very, very important. All right, so now external self-awareness, that was all internal self-awareness. And actually internal self-awareness is more broad than interoceptive awareness, but obviously we don't have a ton of time and I got to hurry up. External self-awareness requires what's called 360 feedback. This just means ask people you trust to take self-awareness assessments with you. So I do this with my wife, actually, because I'm always finding different assessments to use with students, with colleagues, with people I'm working with. And so I'm testing out self-awareness assessments. And so one thing you can do is take a self-awareness assessment and then have someone, so I'll have my wife then take it about me. So she's not assessing herself. She's answering the same questions I answered based on how she thinks I am in relation to that question or that prompt. And then we compare the scores. Is how I assessed myself the same as how she assessed me? And then we'll flip it. She'll take it and I'll do the same thing. It's absolutely fascinating because you might think that you're very self-aware or emotionally intelligent. And you're like, yeah, I do this all the time. And yeah, I understand this. And then the people closest to you who you most trust, you have them take it about you. And sometimes their responses are very different than what you think about yourself. So this is the external self-awareness component, right? You have to be able to match the internal and the external. This is really fun. I've done seminars and workshops with this, practice displaying and identifying emotions and discuss any disconnect. So you have maybe a group of 10. And so you have in a hat a bunch of basic emotions written out on torn pieces of paper. And so someone walks up and no one else knows. That person picks out of the hat an emotion. Let's say it's anger. And then they have to demonstrate without speaking anger. And then the 9 other people have to guess what emotion they're communicating with their body, with their behavior. And so oftentimes this can be a really important moment where someone realizes that what they think is anger is actually perceived by other people as being something completely different. Well, that's a huge self-awareness moment because all along you think maybe you're sending out a cue and people don't receive it the way you want and you wonder why. Well, maybe you're not actually communicating the emotion you think you are, or maybe people aren't receiving it that way, right? So it's a very, very interesting game to play. And then you can even imitate and role play. This is with people who are more familiar. We've done this in my family where it's like imitate one of us in the family when we're happy. Imitate one of us in the family when we're angry. Imitate, and we'll all go around and imitate how different people in the family display different emotions. And when you see someone else imitating how you are, you're like, whoa, I actually look like that. And then everyone else will chime in. Yeah, you actually do that. And it's a self-awareness moment. We were able to gauge how people are perceiving you with how you think you're being perceived. You have strong self-awareness when you see yourself as others see you. So this is where we bring it together. When internal self-awareness meets external self-awareness, and you're succeeding at both. So strong self-awareness is when you see yourself as others see you. The two are matched up. Now, the research shows no matter how strong we are, we always have blind spots. We always are unaware of certain aspects or dimensions of ourselves. And this is why it's so important to be willing to receive feedback from other people and to consistently ask for it. Have a circle of people whom you trust and allow them to tell you how you are. It can be very difficult, right? Because sometimes we don't want that feedback. But if we want self-awareness and we want emotional intelligence, then it's absolutely vital to get this feedback, to be open to it. So let's close with the emotional intelligence implications for communication. Again, the thesis, effective communication requires emotional intelligence. And the research tells us that emotional safety is a prerequisite for open and effective communication. And this is a horrible slide because it has way too much text on it, but I wanted to just get it all on here. This is the core issue when all of this comes together in the context of communication. Our brains are fundamentally threat detectors. That's your brain's number one job, is threat detection. It's looking for threat. Therefore, your brain will bias information accordingly. It's going to cue into things that could be threatening. And even if those things aren't threatening, it might just interpret them as threatening, so it's already prepared. And those who have had traumatic pasts or difficult experiences, this is often the case where it's a threat detection gone awry, where we're always inferring threat, even in environments where it's actually not present. So this is very important. So what's the key to, well, I'll stop there. I'll get to that in a second. The perception of threat shuts down open communication. So number one, we're primarily threat detectors. Two, when we perceive threat, the ability to communicate openly and effectively shuts down. Why? Because the parts of our brain that are most evolved, that we need to be active while we're communicating, are the first to shut down when we feel threatened. I'll say that again because it's very important. The parts of our brain that are most evolved, the executive center, the prefrontal cortex, this is what we want active. This is what we want leading the way when we communicate. It allows us to be creative. It allows us to take perspective. It allows us to put our emotions into context. It allows us to accommodate other people's emotions. It keeps our awareness broad. This part of our brain is the first to go when we suspect that there's threat. Right? And that's because that part of our brain is very metabolically expensive. It takes a lot of energy. So if your brain feels threatened, it's going to immediately conserve energy by saying, oh, perspective, gone. I don't need that. That's a luxury, right? So we go into the shutdown mode like a turtle into the shell. And so because we often lack self-awareness, especially when threatened, we communicate ineffectively. So all of this becomes very problematic. This is why the environment of communication, we have to be sensitive to it. Because if it's an environment that's not conducive to safety, communication will erode. And think about all the environments of communication that are out there now. They're not safe. And as I said before, they're virtual often, and they're disconnected from interpersonal bodily contact or perception. This is huge. This is a huge, huge point that the research shows, is that safety is more than the absence of threat. Safety is more than the absence of threat. Just because we think we're not threatening, or just because we think threat has been removed from an environment, doesn't mean people feel safe. What we need are active cues of safety. We communicate safety more with how we are than we do with what we say. So we have to show safety with our disposition. And the research shows, this is actually called neuroception. Stephen Porges, who's a researcher, has written extensively about this, that we have this ability to perceive the state of other people's nervous systems and the levels of stress and emotionality in other people. And so self-awareness allows us to notice how safe we and others feel while communicating. And so here we go. This is what we dial into. And when we're building self-awareness, emotional self-awareness, this is what we have to pay attention to. It's called affect-biased attention. It just means emotion-biased attention. Where do we read emotional cues in other people? Well, we know that a majority of the circuitry in the brain devoted to communication is oriented to perceiving information in other people's faces. The face is the billboard. The face represents the total state of emotion in a person. And we know this from infancy on, that the baby is constantly looking at the mother or caretaker's face, gauging the expressions and the emotionality in the face. Why? Because the young brain is inferring from the mother's affect on her face and the expressions on her face or the caregiver's face what the total environment is like. If the mother's face is happy and playful and expressing, regulating emotions, then the baby will infer that it's a safe environment. Because if the mother feels safe, obviously the environment is safe. So we read the face. Then we read the intonation of the voice, the inflection of the voice. One of the things that happens when we become stressed out and we feel threatened is the muscles of the middle ear narrow. And we stop hearing the intonations and variations in people speaking. And so we tend to hear people as being flat, and we start determining that what they're saying is threatening, even if the content isn't necessarily threatening. So all it takes is the feeling of threatening to start hearing things completely differently. And then last, the body. We look at the body, how the person's breathing, where the breath is. Are they tense? Are they stiff? How are they holding themselves? And so when you think about, are you an effective communicator? Are you an emotionally intelligent communicator? Are you aware? And this is as a career educator, I have to think about this all the time. What am I communicating with my face? Am I creating cues of safety with my face? Am I showing students that I'm safe and that a classroom is safe by how I show emotion on my face? Am I showing that I'm safe by how I talk? The intonation of how I talk. Pauses in between words. With my body, am I showing that it's safe? We know that threat changes how we are. The face loses expressivity, the voice flattens, and the body stiffens. This is what happens, right? And this is a little kid on here because little kids demonstrate this so perfectly because they lack the ability to suppress emotions. So you can see a kid immediately get into that mode where they're moving into a dysregulated emotional space. And you see it come over their face, changes how they talk, right? A lot of times when we're threatened or stressed, our voice will get very thin. It'll thin out. It'll get flat. It'll move up into the throat. So it's paying attention to these things manifesting within ourselves and also within others. Self-awareness allows us to use these emotional cues to co-regulate, so that when we notice in the course of communicating that we're saying things or things are happening that are causing someone to become dysregulated, we can stop and say, did I say something that upset you? I just want to make sure. Are you with me? Can I communicate in a different way? Right? Gauging your audience. So conversation considerations. When you're having a conversation, purpose. Start with purpose. Why am I communicating? Is this a conversation that's going to go somewhere? Am I just trying to prove that I'm right in this conversation? Or am I trying to prove or learn? Have my perspective broadened in some way? So be very clear about what your purpose is of why you're communicating. Because if you don't know, the conversation's not off to a good start, especially when you're talking about a heated topic. What's the context of the conversation? Do we all feel safe? If you don't feel safe and you can tell the people you're communicating with don't feel safe, don't have the conversation, because it's likely not going to go anywhere good. Can you recognize the signs? What are the signs of dysregulation? I know that when I start holding my breath, or my breath starts migrating up, or I start taking big breaths and offloading a lot of carbon dioxide, I know I'm done. I'm fried. I've lost the bandwidth up here. The prefrontal cortex has gone on vacation, right? My brain is in screensaver mode. And then what tools do you have? If you don't have the ability to call it done in the conversation, maybe you're in a meeting and the meeting's still going and you have to be there. Well, what tools can you lean on to try to regulate your emotion and at least be functional? And then last, exits. What are my exit strategies? Have a specific way of exiting conversations tactfully when you know they're going off the rails. This is the biggest mistake people consistently make, is they will persist in a conversation that is going nowhere. Mm-hmm. And the signs that they're going nowhere come on so early. And so if we're paying attention to them, we can exit and think of all the emotional damage that could be prevented if we all could just recognize earlier in a conversation that it's not going anywhere and to call it quits.
Matt, could I add something just real quick about this? For
sure.
One of the things that Peter T. Coleman at Columbia University says is sometimes it's malpractice to suggest that two people do try and talk to each other in this current environment, because people are having so much trouble with a lot of this regulation. And so one of the things we want to do is set up safe environments where people can dialogue, but do it in a way that we create safety parameters for them. An exit. If you have a mediator, they can call a break. They can see it happening. And one of the things I meant to say earlier that didn't is, it's an interesting question, I think, that I will turn over to the League of Women Voters for later thinking, but I included on my list all sorts of resources that are already in place for groups to get involved with, to see if they can facilitate community dialogue in a safe setting and promote it at a community level in ways where it's not so intense. It's just an interesting add-on. And then also, there's things like Braver Angels where we can practice those skills in online free courses to practice political dialogue without that immediate stress. So there's so many levels of this, I think. But I do think it'd be interesting for League of Women Voters to think, what is our role in this unusual day and age in promoting civic dialogue on a community level and supporting educational resources for people, particularly since our brains are changing if we stay online too long. Anyway, I'll be quiet now, but thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I'll say one thing real quick is that what you were just talking about is when you can, I've done this in classroom spaces and with adults with meetings. If you can start a meeting by taking 1 to 2 minutes where everyone quietly, consciously breathes, that alone puts everyone breathing together connects everyone emotionally and allows us to feel safe. That's one of the most ancient, innate co-regulating activities is breathing together. That's what children do with parents, right? Babies will mimic the breathing patterns of the caretaker, the mother or the father.
And another thing is walking, moving side by side. The evolutionary history of that is being hunter-gatherer. Working at a task while you're moving can tend to kind of trick the brain a little bit out of some of those defensive and create everybody in an inclusive kind of, you know, us against whatever is out there in nature. And so just physically moving, which is why, Lori Rose, your walking program for the league was very intuitive. I'm thinking that we might need questions. I'm going to get out of here.
I'm almost done. If we can establish a baseline of regulation before we communicate, then we have something to compare where we're going against. So if you start a meeting consciously regulating together, consciously becoming emotionally self-aware, you're going to be more likely in the course of that conversation to recognize when you're moving away from that baseline state that you all created together. And I've seen this in classrooms. I mean, this is how I run my own classroom, but I've seen it in meetings too, in corporations, where people will start practicing this and they'll realize, whoa, 5 minutes into a conversation, something was said and everyone started going off the rails, and someone will catch it and say, all right, let's stop. 30 seconds, breathe. When you lose your breathing, you lose your emotional control. When you lose your breathing, you lose your emotional control. That's why, and it's easier to recognize that you're losing your breathing than it is to recognize you've lost your emotions. This is why breathing can be so effective. So I'm going to finish up real quick. Turning emotional intelligence states into traits takes practice. What that means is a state is something we create for a moment. It's fleeting. A trait is something that's enduring. So when we talk about self-awareness, we can develop it as a state in a given moment, right? I can ask you all to let's sit still for 5 minutes. Let's pay attention to our breathing, and we can create a state of emotional self-awareness. But as soon as we're done with that activity, that awareness might go out the window, right? So we have to practice regularly so that that state becomes an enduring trait, something that sticks with us on an ongoing basis, becomes a part of our personality. And we know it's called a dose-response relationship. We know that the more people practice, the higher their emotional awareness gets. And there's no plateau. It just keeps going. And so we're finishing. I just wrote the Mindful Breathing Workbook for Teens, where a lot of this is discussed in this workbook. And what's funny is that even though it's for a teen audience, almost all adults are buying it, hoping that their teens will read it. But I thought I would share it because the book is really about developing these skills via breathing that I've been talking about. And so we'll go to questions. I guess I won't share my breathing machine and all of that. Maybe I'll do that on a different session because I've taken so much time.
Thank you so much, Matt. I really appreciate the perspectives and examples that both of you have given. I have to say, many years ago when I was at a high-stress job interview in New York, somebody said to me, you know, you're sitting there with your resume and you're waiting to be called into the room and sort of grilled over the coals or whatever, preparing. And somebody said to me, just start deep breathing, start taking 3 deep breaths before and calm yourself down. I have to say it was very productive and helpful. So bringing this learning that you both discussed into the league and the city environment in which we operate a little bit, I'm just going to posit a situation for you that we might find ourselves in, and ask both of you if you could have some suggestions just to kick off our Q&A session here. And maybe while we're doing people.
While Lori's doing that, Matt, can I share a screen real quick? Because it's on point for what
Sure.
Lori.
Is my screen still being shared?
Yours is still on.
I don't know how to turn it because the thing to turn it off is not popping up for me.
Maybe our host can do that.
So someone take it away from me.
Wait, I can do it. I think I did it.
Okay, I'm still seeing it. So while we're going through this
How's
one
that?
scenario,
There we go. You took it away. Good.
I'm going to ask that people who have other questions, please think of the questions, and we'll try to go around and just raise your hand or just speak out. We're going to try and be a little bit informal and casual today. So here's the situation. There are a lot of things going on in our communities and a lot of town meetings. And recently, some of those have taken a turn that's quite uncomfortable and has, I would say, up on Matt's scale, things are pretty much at a 10 for most of the speakers. So what if somebody comes in and they had a prepared statement, they intended to go through this whole very nice civil thing, I'm so-and-so, I think this, but then they get there and there's somebody who's speaking out and really upsetting them, really triggering them, throwing, let's say it's a masking discussion, throwing masks around in the room, and they're sitting there and they're feeling the proposed speaker is feeling the environment and letting his level of emotionality go really high up to that 10 level. And they say, well, I can't do that proposed statement that I came in here thinking I was going to speak for 3 minutes about A, but I really want to address what this guy said and do B. And they're completely stressed. And that whole prefrontal cortex is kind of shot. And what advice would both of you have for such a person in this circumstance? How do you take it down so that you can be a civil, respected speaker in the town square?
So you're wondering what the responsibility of the actual speaker is if they are actually in charge of the meeting.
No.
Or they may not be in charge of the meeting.
You're just an attendee and you want
someone else is taking over.
Right. Well, you've just heard somebody say something that makes you really emotionally charged up. And you're thinking, I can't come in and give my prepared statement. I have to respond to the neighbor down the street who said A, and I completely disagree with it. And you're all fired up. That's the scenario that I'm trying to describe, that you throw your script away. And then what do you do to get?
Well, I'll let Matt talk because I think the physical level is really what's important there. But I will say part of your exit plan may be to have your own rescue card available where you can read it and say, wow, I need to stop right now. I realize I'm feeling really anxious about my ability to converse in a way that would be supportive and productive. I'm going to take a time out and would like to revisit this with you once I've regained my composure so that I can better hear you and work this out with you. What is you want to say? This was written by a woman named, Rachel Lamb. And she's a trainer of nonviolent communication, which is actually very appropriate under the circumstances. So one thing is the exit plan, I think that Matt was talking about. But there are certainly others which, conversationally to engage, and then structurally and process wise, sometimes you have to end the meeting because maybe nobody's going to feel safe, and can anyone else in the room hear you anyway under those circumstances. But Matt, I'll let you take that.
I think first and foremost, it's really on the community to establish communication norms and to create a ritual of connection and regulation before a meeting starts. Because if you don't have a baseline, then anything's fair game. People just come in and they might have walked in the door already dysregulated and nothing has stopped them. Nothing has forced them to be self-aware. So they just plow right into whatever it is they need to say. And we all know how contagious and viral emotions can be, especially negative emotions. And when we share them verbally, I mean, they just spread and they hijack people's nervous systems. And so it's really up to the community to value regulated communication, emotionally sensitive communication, and that community forums aren't places to just unload and unleash your frustration. And I think you do that by, one, determining some sort of philosophy or a statement of communication in advance that people agree to. And two, doing something at the beginning of a meeting to show you're entering into a really vital space that's delicate. It's so delicate, and it requires everyone's care.
And it's to be
all,
honored.
Yeah, and all it takes is one person to go off the rails,
Right.
to tear the fabric of it apart. And so if you've got those norms built, they help immunize everyone to the viral negativity, and they help create that baseline that when someone starts going off, you can rein it back in and reestablish a baseline. So that's one. Two is, when we get worked up, we all have this. This is what's so important about emotional self-awareness, is that sensations in the body, specifically tension, drive decision-making, behavior, and communication. And so when we get stressed out, or become emotionally reactive, it's tension building in the body. And so all of a sudden we get this false sense of urgency that we have to say something or else things won't be okay. That's a trap. That's an absolute trap. And as long as you believe that, you are just going to perpetuate the conversation going off the rails.
Well, and also it physiologically, once you've gone off personally, anybody has, kind of lost it. It takes a while to come back down. Yeah. You need a break. And that's where, starting way back when I said, boundaries are really important. We're going to talk about specifically what you can do, but that's where you're talking about all the boundaries now, I think, Matt, too. Is there a norm in the community for communication and structure? Is there a process that is laid out so people know what's expected when they walk in? Students are expected to behave a certain way when they walk in your classroom. They're not supposed to throw a desk, and they know that. But if someone then goes off, then you need another boundary, I think. And that's where sometimes you do have to end a meeting. I mean, you can't, a lot of the things where people are really going off, I gave the example of people kind of losing their minds and thinking violence is just the next best idea. There are people who just need to be heard. There are other people where you just need to set a boundary. And I don't think engaging too long is a good idea when someone's not in a place where they can hear you, or where you're really talking more of a diagnosable problem that is not going to be able to be managed. This is for the 80% of people. Does that make sense?
If I may comment here, one way that league members try to participate in civil discussion is in public participation in, municipal meetings.
I was thinking about that.
And you first of all, you're not quite, if you're lucky to have the agenda and what should be discussed, but public participation can have its own life of its own. And you've got something important to say, but if the previous three speakers are very emotional and they're trying to drive home their point, not necessarily with articulate, logical language, but very emotion language, it can kind of unnerve you when you want to say your own message and make you say, what, I'm not feeling that this timing is right. And I know we've, in our advocacy efforts, are constantly judging, is the timing right?
I think it's a really important question.
And it's a constant.
Well, and sometimes they just say what you see, to say, it really seems like the conversation's getting difficult. I personally am feeling it's difficult. And I'm not sure where maybe we should go next. And then ask someone, how is everyone else? Kind of check in rather than try and control one way or another, but to check in with the group. It just so depends on the circumstances. But I think if we're, I think on the one level, that's why some of these ideas, there was an article that came out recently about Watertown, New York as being the top 1% of interactive and really well conducted conversations at a community level. And one of the reasons, and it talks about some of the reasons, but one of the things you can do in that environment is to try and keep a dialogue going so there is an acceptable way of talking. It seems like national political, the way we talk in national politics is now infusing our community dialogue. And I think that is something we can talk about so that, as Matt said, we can actually discuss what are the standards, what are the expectations to empower whoever it is that's holding the meeting to have that conversation and say those things out loud. But Katie, as you're saying, it's about how do we set the stage to have that part of the conversation. And it may not be in that. Am I making sense with this? It may not be in that environment, but all these things need to be talked about. And they're all, I think, really important to put into place. As a mediator, you're controlling your little space.
We have a question, Lynn. I don't want to interrupt. I think Marion, did you have your hand up, or go ahead, Marion, you're muted.
Yes, I have a question for both of you and maybe how the league could help. I'm going to start with the caucus, which is where all of our boards are born in this town as the caucus comes up with a slate of candidates. The current caucus is being derailed by very loud individuals. They've lost the social contract in the meeting, and the current chairman is not doing an adequate job of calming everyone down and getting the caucus to make sure everybody has a chance to be heard. So there's an example of somebody didn't give that caucus president, who's a volunteer, a little bit of help to know how to run a caucus meeting. And then when you go to the school board meetings, and Matt, this question is for you, do you attend them because you are staff there just to hear how they're run? Is there something the league could do to help do a training for our volunteer board members when they start a new term? These are some helpful ideas for you. Get the meeting set up so that people coming for public content understand no booing, no clapping. We're all going to breathe together, all those kinds of things. Have you ever done a training like that? Is this something the league might be interested in, considering the fractiousness of what's happening now in particularly our school board meetings? I will leave it to you guys.
One of the most vital insights of the emotional intelligence research is that the person of influence or people of influence in any given situation establish the emotional climate and tone. I'll say that again. The person or people of influence in any given situation establish the emotional climate and tone. John Gottman calls these meta emotions, how we're going to feel about what we feel. And so whether you're a parent, whether you're a coach, a teacher, a school board board member, or president of some organization, everyone is looking to you to regulate the emotions of people present. And if you are falling asleep at the wheel, that's not good for everyone else, because now it's lowest common denominator. Mm-hmm. And that's where things just go off the rails. So this is why this is what leadership ultimately is about, is teaching people where attention goes and how to pay attention to certain things and how to conduct yourself in certain ways and what's worth valuing and following, et cetera. And if a leader isn't internalizing that and instructing from that place in some way, then it's not a good sign.
Lori, could I interject something? This is Judy
Sure.
Armstrong.
Yes.
Um,
please.
you know, and anybody who might have been there the night that I helped out a sister league, I believe solidly in Robert's Rules of Order. And, you know, when my mother grew up, every single civic organization used Robert's Rules. That established a community norm of mutual respect. We've gotten totally away from that. You know, PTA and the Lions Club and Exchange Club and all of those things at one time all had Robert's Rules of Order in place. And it created a mutual understanding of how to dialogue civilly. I think that the knowledge we have gained in league about Robert's Rules as pertains to how government ought to run gives us an opportunity to help reestablish the mindset of fair and equal treatment and mutual respect in public meetings.
I think that's an excellent point, Judy, and maybe one of the takeaways from this meeting, which I think would be very valuable, is that we have another one with league members, and maybe we have some facilitators or guests such as Matt and Lynn to bring that learning back to the town square and to start to talk about how to set those norms at the beginning of a meeting. And I think that one of the things that I heard in league when we were talking about Robert's Rules of Order, and when we went on Zoom, it gets harder, is that from one member, I heard that not everybody knows or understands them these days, and what is, you know, what has replaced them, if anything has. And I don't think the name of the rule paradigm matters as much as the fact that we do have some rules, and there are a set of shared expectations. And at the state league level, actually on Monday night, we're going to do an exercise with a facilitator that will start with that kind of process where you create shared norms and expectations and then take off after that. So I think there's work that we could do. I think those of you who have attended some of these meetings or seen them on recording will agree that it's nothing like what was present in years past. And I know that at our earliest creation of this program, we were talking about an interactive thing, maybe in person when times are a little easier. And I would like people who are participating, we have your email, if you wouldn't mind, if we could reach out and maybe survey the group and see if you'd like to get together for another meeting to further develop this, see what tools the league could use. I agree with Marion. I think this might be a good spot for the league voice, because for 100 years, the league has been holding civilized candidate debates, and compared to some of the ones that have been held by news organizations, actually the league many years ago did the national presidential debates. I think there's a real sense of rule-bound decorum, and maybe that's something that we could work with the local, the caucus, the city, the school boards, to create some shared norms about how these meetings happen. And I personally would like to explore that. So we'll try to follow up and send you some information and ideas about where this conversation could go, because I think it's important. Do we have any other questions from people who haven't spoken up yet, who have questions or comments? And then I think if not, we'll close. Anybody? Katie, do you see any hands?
I don't. I hope everyone will sort of think this over and get the wheels turning, and let's come back at this topic, maybe in person. We'll see. I don't see any other hands.
I'm trying to get rid of my screen share and I'm unable to do it now, just like that. So I'm just going to leave it there.
We can take the list of participants and send out your resources to them, Lynn, even if we can't do it on screen here today.
Oh, that's fine. And I put my email in the chat. If anyone wants to send me an email and ask for them, they can do it that way, or I can just send it to you, Lori, and however.
Okay. I'll read it off in case people are not looking at the chat. It's Lynn, Lynn, at Gaffigan, Gaffigan, mediation.com, and mediation is mediation, mediation.com. So with that, I would like to thank all of you for participating. I'd like to thank our speakers for their excellent preparations, and thanks to Katie for envisioning this program and putting it together. Thanks to our participants for giving up part of your afternoon on a beautiful fall day to join us. And we will be in touch via email with possible follow-ups, and please, let's keep this very open, and any suggestions you have for possible follow-ups or ideas, we can keep circulating around, and hopefully we'll come to some consensus about possible next steps. So in the meantime, I encourage everybody to breathe deeply and mindfully. And
I want to, one thing I will do is, so that we all don't suffer from alexithymia, I'll send you a link to the world's most beautiful list of feelings, words, and needs and interest words. It's just fantastic, Matt. I'll send it to you too. I just think it's great. I use it in the training too, and she deserves a lot of credit for putting it together. So acknowledge each other, everybody.
thank you, everybody.
Thank you,
It was
everybody.
excellent program.
Thank you, speakers.
Thank you.
Really
you.
great.
Thank you,
It's a good
everybody.
meeting. Bye.
Bye.